This week's topic includes different types of communication messages. We're going to cover both verbal and nonverbal communication. I'll have two separate videos to discuss those two separate chapters, chapters 5 and chapter 6. This video is going to cover verbal communication. So when we talk about verbal communication, we're not talking specifically about what you hear. It's referring to the words and the messages that are being sent. So if you remember from chapter 1 when we talked about the different models of communication, what was occurring in the interpersonal interaction, we talked about messages being sent. This is what we're going to focus on today, these messages, and we're going to look at how they work. So the first thing your chapter discussed were the principles of verbal communication in these verbal messages, and there were 8 different principles, ways that these messages work. Now, I'm not going to go over all of them because you're going to read about them, but I will just go down the list so that we can make sure we're on the same page. So when we talk about verbal messages, we're looking at the idea that messages, the meanings are in people. So the meaning is determined by the individuals, not by necessarily the word itself. We have to agree upon what a word means. So for example, what does best friend mean to you? Or what does love mean to you? We know that the definition varies among people, and that's what creates miscommunication or conflict. The second principle are meanings are denotative and connotative. Messages, the third, are anonymous and anonymous. They then vary in abstraction, vary in politeness, vary in immediacy, they can deceive, and they vary in assertiveness. One important thing to read about in your chapter, and hopefully you will go back and look at it, is to look at some of the ways that you can increase your assertiveness, because it's important to communicate assertively. That's part of being competent. So making sure that people understand what you're saying, they understand the problem that is being addressed. So I'm going to diverge a little bit from what was covered in your chapter, and I want to talk a little bit about the nature of language. I think it's important to understand where language comes from, some of the key ideas, and some of the guiding rule systems. So in your PowerPoint, I talked about the nature of language in relation to language being symbolic and subjective. So this goes back to the principle that meanings are in people and not in words. So again, people have to agree upon these definitions, the connotative and denotative idea. I also included in the PowerPoint slide to further highlight this idea that the meanings are subjective, the words are subjective, by looking at different words in different cultures. So one of the words I like, I'm Italian, is the idea of culacino. So this word might not mean anything to you, if you don't speak Italian or if you're not Italian. But if you are Italian, Italians have agreed that this word, the meaning behind the word, is a mark left on a table by a cold glass. So we kind of have the word in English, condensation, but it's not really the same idea. But it just sounds, I think, a little prettier. I also like the idea of, if you speak Spanish, the sobremesa. So this is very cultural, and it shows how words can show cultural values. So this idea of the sobremesa is the time you spend after lunch or dinner talking to the people. So it's more about the interpersonal connection than the meal itself. So again, goes back to what this particular culture values. And then finally, I always like to talk with students about jayas. So this is an Indonesian word, and we all think it, and we don't have this word in English, and so I think you should start using it. It means a joke told so poorly and so unfunny that one cannot help but laugh. We've all been there, but we don't have just that one word to describe that. But in Indonesia, they do. So again, words vary, words are subjective, and culture plays a role in the words in the way that words are understood and used. So I had talked about the rule systems associated with language, and you saw a slide in the PowerPoint, and I highlighted 4 of what we call the rule-governed issues surrounding language. So the first has to do with phonology. So these are rules surrounding the idea of sounds. So when we're learning language, we go through these 4 sort of rule steps. So when you're first learning to talk, as little kids do, they have to learn sounds. right? And as you're learning to read, you learn these individual sounds. So you have to learn what the t, right? A T, what sound that makes, and what happens when you add the H. So what sound does a T and an H make when they're combined? So the th. So we have morphemes and phonemes when we're learning those. So that's really important to learn those sound rules, because then once you learn those individual sounds, you can combine the sounds and those become words. And then you have syntactic rules. And these are the structure, the rules in terms of the way sentences are organized. So we have the verb, we have the noun, you remember all these from your English classes, and they go in a particular order. So if I said love you, I am violating a syntactic rule. That makes no sense. We know that I have to say I love you in order to have a meaningful, rule-structured sentence. Semantic rules have to deal with meaning. So again, we can go back to the connotative, denotative idea. So how do you come to make meaning with words? And finally, the pragmatic rules. So this is how you use particular words in certain contexts. So thinking about, and I had a list, for example, how would you ask an acquaintance out on a date? What are some of the rules associated with that? How can you use words in a particular way to ask someone out? What would you say, what's appropriate in terms of declining an dinner invitation? So let's say you hate someone's cooking. You know it's going to be an awful dinner. Are you going to say, no, I don't want to come because I hate your cooking? No. We have learned that there are certain acceptable things to say, certain words to use in order to maintain that relationship, but also to ensure that we don't have to suffer through a horrible dinner. And then one thing I wanted to touch on is how language can impact the worldview or perception. We're going to talk more about perception later on in the class, but just thinking about how words can change the way we perceive the world. So one new word that has come about in the past year is this idea of post-truth, and this was in your PowerPoint. So think about this idea of really what is truth? Is it really based on emotion and personal belief, or is truth based in objective, verifiable facts? I don't know. That idea, this word, is changing the way that we come to understand, perceive, and talk about the world. One of the last things I want to talk about is this idea of perception in the world. So there is a researcher who studies this. His name is Sapir. And you read about what he said about the world. And basically what he did is he came up with this other guy, Worf, a hypothesis about language in the worldview. And so they hypothesized that the way people think about the world is really affected by their native language. So the first language that you learn to speak is really going to influence the way that you come to understand the world. And they believe that there were two ways to think about this. So there's what's called linguistic determinism, which is a very constrained idea that it's really impossible to truly learn another language, that you are going to be so constrained by the initial language you learned that you're not really going to understand and effectively communicate in that other language. So the language determines the way we see the world. The other view is the linguistic relativism, which is where I would fall in terms of my view. So this is the idea of the relationship between language and thought. So your language is going to predispose you to see the world in a particular way. It's going to structure and influence the way that you see the world, but it doesn't determine it. So this means that I can indeed learn another language, become immersed in another culture, and then maybe shift the way that I talk about and perceive the world around me. So for example, those of you who speak a foreign language, maybe Spanish, you've learned the idea of the difference between the tú and the usted. So it seems relatively simple, but bound within that are different values associated with the way that that culture is made up. So if you use tú with someone, you are showing more familiarity, right? Think of more interpersonal, friend sort of language. If you use usted, it connotes respect. So we can understand that and we can use that, and that's going to shape the way that I then engage with people based on the words that I'm using. So that would be a linguistic relativism example. I also gave you some examples. I don't know if you were able to figure them out, some sort of riddles, but again, it's playing with words and the way that we use words to understand the world. So can I trick you? So the example with the father who was driving the car with his son, do you know what the answer is? The surgeon is his mother. So I was able to play with some of your preconceived notions about what a doctor is, and what we associate with the idea of doctor. The second one having to do with somebody makes it and sells it, buys it, doesn't use it. Any guesses? It's a coffin. Again, the way that I arrange the words, so thinking about syntactic rules, I was able to play with and potentially influence, trick you, or confuse you in terms of what I was trying to talk about. And that was indeed a coffin. And finally, I want to end with the idea of disconfirmation and confirmation. This goes back to the idea of communication competence. So what's appropriate and effective? So I really want you to go back through the reading and read through this idea of some disconfirming and confirming ways of speaking. We know that racism is a problem, right? We know heterosexism is a problem, ageism. So be aware of this type of language and ways to avoid it. Sexism, cultural identifiers. So go through the guidelines for using verbal messages effectively, and hopefully you will become a more competent, effective speaker.